I think I'm going to be sitting here.
I don't know if we've actually met. I apologize. Rob Stavins.
It's okay, David, like her, yeah. We only drove here to get there.
I know, but I was already sitting down in the front seat.
I know. You were in a conversation, and we were in a conversation.
Yeah. Also, if I was turning around all the time, I would actually, in Carson, I would get nauseous.
Yeah, I have that problem too. Full crowd here. Pretty full. Okay. Yeah, although my flight isn't like till 2, so I guess I'll be spending the morning at the hotel and then a couple hours at the airport waiting. And I have a column to read, so...
Oh, you can do that?
Yeah.
New York?
Philadelphia.
Oh, I was wondering otherwise, because there must be other flights to New York.
Yeah, no, for Philadelphia with no layovers, that was the one good option. I think there was one at like 7 in the morning, but at first I assumed it would be here. I didn't want to have to get up at 4:30 to get up to an early flight, so I booked it late. Then learned we were at the airport hotel.
Yeah.
Although you're not.
I'm not, because I have a meeting tomorrow in St. Paul early in the morning, so I moved to a St. Paul hotel. I'm meeting a colleague coming in from out of town. It's something completely different.
Yeah, so that's why I'm leaving the flight. I chose late because I didn't want to have to be here super early, but then when I found out I'm standing around the airport, but that's fine. As I said, I'll just get my writing done while I'm waiting around.
Well, originally I was going to be getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning in order to catch a 5 a.m. flight nonstop to New Orleans, because I had something in New Orleans on Friday, which I was thrilled approximately 6 days ago. It got canceled, and so I'm going back to Boston, but then as a result of that, they opened up this time, so we're this meeting, but just briefly, and then I'm flying out at 1 o'clock also, about 5.
Oh, well, maybe I'll run into you in the airport.
It's very possible. Delta?
No, I'm on a...
I'm on Delta. Delta is when I fly if at all possible.
I normally don't, but it was a very nice flight coming here.
Did you go to New Orleans tomorrow?
I was originally supposed to, but unfortunately that got canceled because I was going to have to get up at 3 in the morning for that flight. So that's canceled, so instead I have some meetings or something else in St. Paul tomorrow morning, which is why I'm sitting here today. And I'm flying back to Boston on a 1 o'clock flight.
That is very nice. My plane leaves at 6:35 tomorrow morning.
Oh gosh.
Yes, with the
Wow.
The aspiration is to be home in time to pick up my daughter from school because Thursday is my pickup day and she's 8 and there's a lot of consternation if the one day that I do pick up is not.
Where are you flying into?
I'm flying to Westchester. So I
that's
connect to
nice.
LaGuardia.
Oh, you do connect to LaGuardia.
Sorry, not LaGuardia. To O'Hare.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So you fly from here to...
To O'Hare, which is like 35 or 40 minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
And then from there to Westchester.
I
But then
remember
Westchester is 16 minutes from the house, so that's
Oh yeah, that was always nice.
So those days of getting home to pick up kids at school are going for me. I'm empty nesters.
Yeah, how many kids do you have?
We have 2. But
Are they in the Boston area?
they both are. Knock on wood that they'll last, but I don't know how long they'll last. Yeah.
Especially in a geographically mobile area.
Yes, I'm very lucky. Very lucky.
Neat. Neat.
We have a dog now, so I have to get home to it.
Yeah, absolutely. What kind of dog?
We have a miniature Australian Labrador.
So we just last fall got a schnoodle. Oh yeah. Totally.
I don't have pictures of my kids anymore.
I know pictures of the dog. We have a schnoodle, a schnauzer mini poodle combination. She jumps like a kangaroo and looks like a schnauzer.
So they said
Hypothetical.
the idea of the Labradoodle, the sweetness of the lab and the intelligence of the poodle, we think we only got the lab part.
Sort of.
All right.
Well, good evening, and welcome to tonight's event on climate policy and religion. I'm Dan Hoffrenning. I'm a professor of political science, and I'm also director of the new public affairs program at St. Olaf, the Institute for Freedom and Community. The purpose of the Institute is to further the civic mission of the college, to develop what I like to call the St. Olaf approach to public affairs. That approach is a work in progress. I think we're defining it as we speak. We define it at events like this. But at its core, we have a commitment to civil and respectful discourse, to a consideration of a broad range of viewpoints. We reject narrow ideological approaches. We're not right-wing or left-wing. Rather, we're seeking to create an academic program that brings to campus creative and imaginative scholars and public servants who can speak to the pressing public issues of our time. Our program is rooted in the liberal arts. That's a distinctive feature of it, including the study of religion. That's on full display tonight as we consider the Papal Encyclical on the environment. Let me offer a few brief comments about the encyclical, then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Professor Becky Judge, to introduce our panelists and moderate our program. In his encyclical, Pope Francis is really trying to speak to a broad audience, not just the Catholic Church. In his words, he wants to enter into a dialogue with all people who are united by the same concern. And so in a world of texts and tweets and Snapchats, he offers a sustained argument to all of us about the importance for caring for the earth. The Pope also makes a strong point that this encyclical on the environment is not theologically novel. In the encyclical, he surveys scripture and Catholic social teaching and notes a long tradition of concern for the earth. And he sums it, or he points to its culmination, with the statement that there is really no biblical or theological justification for what he calls a tyrannical anthropocentrism, unconcerned for other creatures. At its core, Pope Francis highlights the human roots of our ecological crisis. He sees what he calls a technocratic paradigm overwhelming the earth. This is the intensity and rapaciousness of modern economies, along with dizzying technological change and increasing consumption, all mixing together to cause an environmental crisis. He decries a world in which technology, efficiency, and profit are at the core of human life. And so in this, he continues a skepticism of market economies that is a major part of Catholic social teaching. And notably, of course, he criticizes market approaches to improving our climate, such as carbon credits, because he feels they don't do enough to constrain our prolific consumption. He calls for something deeper, and I'm sure our panelists will have more to say about this point. He ends by highlighting the potential for progress in international fora, such as the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. But perhaps the heart of this encyclical is a pastoral call to all of us, a call for spiritual discernment, to cultivate ecological virtues, to consume less. In one section, he calls for nothing less than an environmental conversion. He says that the Christian tradition calls all of us to lives of humility, gratitude, respect for the earth, and a care for the poor. These all go together. Well, I, of course, could go on, but we have some great panelists to do that. And so I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Professor Becky Judge. Becky is an environmental economist. She is also Associate Dean of the Social Sciences. She serves on the Advisory Committee for the Institute for Freedom and Community, and she will also moderate tonight's discussion.
Thank you all for coming tonight. It's great to see so many people here. As moderator, let me just start before I introduce our distinguished panel by suggesting how we're going to do this tonight. We have three people giving three sets of prepared remarks. And I think it's going to be easier for the flow if we sort of listen to what the whole panel first, holding our questions until the end. And that way the panelists can engage with each other and we can engage with the panelists. And if it's deadly quiet, I have some questions all ready for them. So it'll be a lot of fun. I'm going to introduce our panelists as they appear on my left. First, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Christiana Picard. She comes to us from Fordham University, where she engages in research and teaching in this wonderful area that's theology and science and ethics. She's presently an assistant professor there in the Department of Theology, but she is also an affiliate in the Department of Environmental Studies and also in the Department of American Studies. So, like many professors here, she's a multi-citizen. She spent her career so far exploring the just distribution of water rights. And that puts her in a uniquely apt position to be becoming a critical voice on the public forum discussing the Papal Encyclical. Her book, called Just Water, talks about offering a rights-based approach to access to fresh water that is very much in keeping with the tone and the motivation, it seems, of the Papal Encyclical. Like the Pope, she cautions against a technologically prudent a solely technological solution to the world's problems, and instead tells us to be technologically prudent and avoid the temptation to proclaim technocratic solutions to what are, at the core, ethical problems. Professor Picard received her BA in human biology from Stanford and her master's and PhD from Yale. Welcome to the land of 10,000 lakes.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Professor Robert Stavins from Harvard University. He's the Albert Pratt Professor of Business and Government. He is also the director of Harvard's Environmental Economics program and chairman of the Environmental and Natural Resources faculty group at the Kennedy School at Harvard University. He received his BA in philosophy from Northwestern, his MS in agricultural economics from Cornell, and his PhD in economics from Harvard, which he joined the faculty of the very next year, which is quite an accomplishment. Professor Stavins has written extensively on the use of economic instruments as a means of obtaining environmental objectives. Within this body of research, he's considered such varied environmental topics as forestry diversity, as well as carbon emissions reductions and the proper management of solid waste. His publication record is so wide and so big and so long that twice now Edward Elgar Press has published a compendium of his articles, of his published articles. In 1999, they published a book of 25 of his articles, Environmental Economics and Public Policy, and again in 2013, a book called The Economics of Climate Change, Environmental Policy. Together, these books, and these are just two of his books, are 1,026 pages. Just to let you know. Stavins has recently returned from participating in the Paris climate talks as an invited lecturer. This was in his capacity as the director of the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, whose mission is to help negotiating countries identify a design infrastructure in this post-Kyoto world that would help us arrive at a policy that is scientifically sound, economically rational, and hopefully politically pragmatic. His remarks tonight will help us see what that sort of policy would look like. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Damon Linker, senior correspondent with the weekly magazine called The Week, consulting editor at the University of Pennsylvania Press, and former contributing editor at the New Republic. Among the hundreds of articles in the popular press, Dr. Linker is also the author of two books, one, The Theocons, and The Religion Test. Both books examine the rise of religiosity in our time as part of sort of a counter revolution, whose ultimate goal is nothing less, this is according to Dr. Linker, than the end of secular politics in America. Dr. Linker argues that Pope Francis in general and his encyclical in particular represent a rejection of the American conservative movement as championed by the theocons, as he calls them, and that this is a most decidedly inconvenient pontiff to the theocons. Linker instead calls us to, I lost my notes on this one, I'm sorry. He calls us to listen, here we go, that we should listen to this Pope with a willingness to learn from the Pope's arguments and to wrestle with this theologically and scrupulously informed criticism of what he believes, this is the Pope, to be the moral vacuum at the heart of contemporary of capitalist society. Dr. Linker has a BA from Ecological College in philosophy. His master's is from NYU in history, and he got a PhD in political science from Michigan State University. It's my pleasure to introduce all three panelists, and without any further, I send it over to Dr. Peppard. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. And while I am not of the millennial generation, therefore not on Snapchat, I am pleased to tell you that all three of us panelists are on Twitter. So if any of you are interested in that, you can find us there and tag us should you feel compelled by any one-liners. So I have 15 minutes and 3 points to make, which gives us about 5 minutes per point. In good academic fashion, there are roughly 2 to 3 subpoints per point, and you'll be happy to know there's not a quiz at the end. Here are the 3 main areas that I'm going to cover. First of all, what kind of thing is an encyclical, and what is Laudato Si in particular? Secondly, what can we say about its aspirational and perhaps its real positive outcomes or impacts? And then third, where does this encyclical fall short? So first, what kind of thing is an encyclical, and especially Laudato Si? Well, an encyclical is an authoritative document in the legacy of Catholic teaching that is promulgated by the Pope, having been composed and written by a range of experts, including but not limited to the Pope, in consultation with a range of scientific and social scientific councils and various advisors. It is given the imprimatur of the Pope. It is considered a significant incursion into contemporary, in this case, social, environmental, and political issues in ways that are linked with the moral traditions of the Catholic Church and Catholic intellectual traditions. It is not necessarily an infallible document. That's a technical term in Catholic world. It is instead seen to be a kind of guide to thinking through moral dimensions of contemporary problems. This encyclical, Laudato Si, is the first to centralize ecology as a question and an encyclical. So while the environment had come up as a somewhat ancillary issue in prior encyclicals since about 1967, the environment and ecological concerns more broadly have never before been centralized, and that's part of why this encyclical is a big deal. If, however, you were paying attention to news cycles in 2015, you may have noted that much of the hype over this encyclical was precisely that in it the Pope was going to pontificate on climate change. He was going to say whether it was happening or not, and then what we should do about it. And in fact, this type of media coverage that the Pope was coming out with, the climate change encyclical, or after its release, referring to the document as the Pope's climate change encyclical, is a little bit misleading. It's misleading for several reasons. And as with many misleading monikers, there is an aspect of truth embedded within it. So how is it false that this is a climate change document? Well, it's false because the document is about much more. Situated in the canon of Catholic social teaching, it takes on topics of ecology writ large, as well as ethics. The fundamental patterns of relationship among humans and other humans, between humans and God in theological perspective, and humans and the earth that sustains us. So relationships in three directions: humans, 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 God, and humans and the earth. So ecology here is not just about the environment, though the environment is part of it. It is about patterns of interconnection, many of which, says the Pope, have decidedly moral textures. This will come as no surprise to anyone who's taken seminars on social ethics or environmental ethics, but again, it is new for the Pope to be saying it in particularly this way. So in these ways, the encyclical is not only about climate change. In fact, the phrase climate change comes up only about 12 times in the encyclical. However, there is some truth to the fact that this is a climate change encyclical, because climate change is the first of several examples that the Pope gives in the first chapter of the document that are signs of the times of the intersections of ecological and social degradations. It embodies the paradoxes of our current milieu. He frames it as the problem of pollution and climate change together. And these are problems linked to, as he sees it, industrialization and the pursuit of progress, not necessarily bad in themselves, but worth considering how they manifest. Problems of inequality and exclusion in global scope, of extractive economies, of political ecology, and the very real challenges to collective action in a warming, polluted, populous, and radically unequal world. Surely in my colleagues' remarks, we will talk about more of the specifics in terms of how climate change is noted in the encyclical, but I want to set the frame for now by noting the Pope's diagnosis about climate change as a moral problem. So this is apart from any particular things he says about cap and trade, etc. This quote that I'm about to read is from the 25th paragraph of the document. Side note, when you're citing an encyclical, students, in case you have to write a paper on this presentation, you cite the paragraph number, not the page number. So this is paragraph 25. Climate change, writes the Pope, is a global problem with grave implications: environmental, social, economic, political, and for the distribution of goods. It represents one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day. Its worst impact will probably be felt by developing countries in coming decades. He goes on to explain various contexts: fisheries, deforestation. He writes that the poor have no other financial activities or resources which can enable them to adapt to climate change or face natural disasters, and their access to social services and protection is very limited. Climate change leads to migration, he explains. This affects the livelihood of the poor, great uncertainty for them and their children. There's been a tragic rise, he notes, in the number of environmental migrants who are not technically counted as refugees. And he diagnoses, sadly, on the global scene, there is widespread indifference to such suffering, which is even now taking place throughout our world. Our lack of responses to these tragedies involving our brothers and sisters points to the loss of that sense of responsibility of our fellow men and women on which all civil society is founded. Climate change here is part of broader ethical concerns. And as this passage indicates, the pastoral voice, appeal, and religious charism of Pope Francis pervades. Here the Pope diagnoses disordered relationships, and a term that comes up frequently in the encyclical is exclusions. He's concerned about social and environmental exclusions. What does this mean? Ways that patterns of relating, whether through economic or political exchange or other mechanisms, prevent people from expressing and achieving their fundamental human dignity, from exercising agency and freedom. Now, we in the US may not necessarily see this, but it is real. And as the Pope puts it in Laudato Si', this is paragraph 49, it needs to be said that, generally speaking, there's little in the way of clear awareness of problems which especially affect the excluded, yet they are the majority of the planet's population, billions of people. These days, they're mentioned in international political and economic discussions, but one often has the impression that their problems are brought up as an afterthought, a question which gets added almost out of duty or in a tangential way, if not treated merely as collateral damage. Indeed, when all is said and done, they frequently remain at the bottom of the pile. He goes on to say that an ecological and environmental approach to ethics must always entail a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. In light of this, the Pope goes on to propose that there are real kinds of social and ecological debts that are owed to the poor, the global poor, the billions. Pardon me. He writes, for example, a true ecological debt exists, particularly between the global north and south, connected to commercial imbalances with effects on the environment and the disproportionate use of natural resources by certain countries over long periods of time. The world is not quite so flat as we might think. And he notes that these are intimately related, though in complex ways, of course, as I'm sure we'll discuss and debate later. These are intimately and complexly related to patterns of value endemic to late capitalist, extractive, production-oriented market economies in which much labor and extractive resource potential is outsourced. So we may argue to the degree with which the economic diagnoses are apt, but the connection is what is important between political economic patterns and social and environmental exclusions and degradations. And these, in turn, are deep in the heart of Catholic social teaching, as was noted in the introduction to this session. So of course, we should ask, does this pontificating really matter? Or, part two, what can we say about the aspirational and perhaps the real impacts of this document? Now, Pope Francis's encyclical has undoubtedly galvanized a series of conversations about its meaning. Exhibit A, we are here tonight. And these are really important, not just for those of us who happen to make our careers thinking about such things, but also for those of us who inhabit this planet and are trying to do so ethically and to understand how the textures of our daily lives and patterns of interaction impact people who we may never see, may never meet, future generations, and the earth that sustains us. So, how might the leadership of a prominent religious figure be significant in the present day? 3 sub-examples. Number 1, at Pontifex. He tweets, ladies and gentlemen. He's the most retweeted person in the world, although technically, from what I understand, it's not actually the Pope tweeting, it's, one of his cadre of guys. And he has 8.8 million-ish Twitter followers. Now, the Pope's Twitter account only follows 8 other accounts, which are Pope accounts in other languages, but that's a different conversation. And, before we go all gaga over the number of followers he has, let me be the first to say that social media popularity is not necessarily a measure of moral rightness. Not going to say what could be said about the Kardashians or whatever. It's a measure of how many people are listening, right? That's what social media followers are. And some people listen intensively, other people listen for fun, other people listen because they like to get irked. But nonetheless, it's a measure, somewhat imprecise, but a measure of how many people are listening. There is also a lot of love for this Pope, not just among Catholics. Right? We've seen all kinds of liberal media pundits who have very little love for the institutional Catholic Church go gaga over Pope Francis, and that in itself is an interesting phenomenon. But just because the Pope is beloved and has a lot of Twitter followers doesn't mean that he's right. It doesn't necessarily erase problematic institutional legacies of abuse, colonialism, domination of women, of people of color, exclusions that are perpetuated within the institution of the Catholic Church. There's no such thing as absolution by absolutism, and the Church most definitely has its own deeply problematic histories that ought not to be greenwashed. And yet, even in recognition of these problematic legacies, it is possible to use platforms of power for good. So climate change, for example, was one of the first things that the Pope mentioned when he stepped off of his plane onto the White House lawn and engaged with the President of the United States during his visit in September, in which he applauded the EPA's efforts towards some kind of carbon policy. Secondly, the Pope is the head of a small, very small state, the Vatican. It's a carbon neutral state, and it's an observer nation to the UN. So addressing the UN in September 2015, Pope Francis immediately called attention to the natural environment and the vast ranks of the excluded, echoing what we heard in the encyclical. He added, these sectors are closely interconnected and made increasingly fragile by dominant political and economic relationships. That is why rights must be forcefully affirmed by working to protect the environment and putting an end to exclusion. He then called for approval of the Sustainable Development Goals and progress towards a meaningful agreement in Paris, about which Professor Stavins can speak more extensively. Third, let's not overlook the fact that the Pope is the head of the most hierarchical, centralized religious institution in the world with over 1 billion adherents, and Catholicism's claims to advocate for rights to life have not traditionally been interpreted through the lens of tree hugging, right? Bringing the full resonances then of robust Catholic moral traditions to bear on ecological, environmental, and social problems, there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of potential energy there, a lot of potential moral modes of analysis, and this is interesting, at least to scholars like me. But is there actual kinetic impact and difference made by the Pope? Well, some studies have begun to say yes. According to a poll done through Yale University last fall, 17% of Americans and 35% of Catholics say that even in the 5 months since the release of the encyclical, Pope Francis's position on global warming had influenced their own views of the issue, namely that it's happening, climate change is, and that something should be done. For a religiously strong nation with polarized forms of media debate that have tended to call climate change into question, this is significant. But let's be clear that while it is a major incursion into thinking ethically about climate change and related ecological issues, this is not necessarily a policy brief. The encyclical is not a policy brief. It is, again, a document in the lineage of Catholic intellectual and moral tradition. It has political and economic implications, but it's not a strict roadmap for policy. It's a catalyst. It prompts us, I think, to ask who or what economies and politics serve, and how. Who benefits? Who bears the burdens, or what? How ought these economies, these political entities to be oriented towards what kinds of goods, towards what visions of flourishing? Figuring out the rest, the roadmap, the how, that's quite frankly up to us. And this leads me to my third and final set of observations. Where does the encyclical fall short? Here also I have 3 sub-examples. First, the encyclical is not a policy brief, and it's not strictly speaking about climate change, as I've noted. So, as a result, when the Pope talks about climate change in this document, it says some things that sound, frankly, weird to economists and policymakers who have been studying these things for decades and are experts in their domain. So whether in the words of my colleague Robert Stavins on the panel, or William Nordhaus writing in the New York Review of Books last summer, there are real objections, forcible ones, to be made to various of the Pope's framings of cap and trade, for example. There's a lot more to be debated and specified about carbon pricing, carbon taxes, cap and trade, and more, as well as issues of corruption, multinational corporations, and extractive economies and energy policies more generally. So that's fine. Let's figure out how to do it right. I love experts. Let's just think as hard as we can and as well as we can collectively about the mechanisms at our disposal. Second, in this lineage of critiques, is a more ethical theoretical critique that comes from a place of being a feminist ethicist who thinks about bodies that matter. I applaud the focus on ecology in this encyclical. I love it. And I love the stipulation that there are constitutive, interdependent relationships that shape the parameters of living and being in this world for humans and other kinds of creatures. I'm drawn to the idea of integral ecology, the idea that social, economic, political, and environmental degradations are linked, even though the idea of integral ecology is pretty amorphous in the document. So hurrah! Ecology gets a hearing, and that is great. But I also have some reservations here, and they boil down to this. We know that Catholicism has some very deep, entrenched attachments to particular norms about sex and gender and morality. So how do such notions of gender, embodiment, and so forth undergird Catholic magisterial assertions about right forms of ecological relationships? What implications might these bear when talking about practical solutions to environmental problems? Does ecology, for example, entail the necessity of hierarchical relationships between men and women, in which biology is destiny, in which birth control is an illicit form of female agency, in which heterosexual marriage is expected, in which complementarity is the norm, in which women disproportionately bear gender burdens? I hope not, but the legacy of Catholic tradition doesn't give me a lot of hope in that direction. So, in some ways, radical though this encyclical by Pope Francis may seem, the ecology of Laudato Si is not perhaps so revolutionary. And finally, my third point here. There's a close-to-home aspect of the encyclical that bears further development. It's a problem and temptation that besets all forms of theorizing about collective action from a position of political and economic privilege, such as the one that I inhabit. I mean, for crying out loud, I flew here from New York this morning on an airplane and have been delighted to have the freedom, the liberty, and the air travel at my disposal to do so. We participate, those of us in the US, most of us in this room presumably, in these conversations from a place of privilege. It's not necessarily a bad thing. We didn't necessarily choose to be born into industrialized nations and inherit the kinds of, in the words of Pope Francis, ecological and social debts that are entailed. But inherit them we have, because this is where we find ourselves. And I am attached to my forms of privilege. I'm attached to being a professor, to my elite education, to being able to fly here and converse with esteemed colleagues and you all tonight. But still, I live within the paradox of trying to be attentive to exclusions, to working as an ethicist within all that my life is predicated upon. So what do we in the US do about our privilege, collectively, not just individually, in ways that empower and equalize? This is part of why the Pope's call for action at the Conference of Parties meeting in Paris in last fall was so significant. A first thing to say is that we must stop talking as if the world is flat, as if we equals all human beings who are equally responsible for the mess that the planet is in. Sure, we're all human, we all mess up, fossil fuels are great, I love energy sources and heat and light and internet connections as much as the next person, but in historical perspective, let it be said, with the feminist philosopher Chris Cuomo, that climate change was manufactured in a crucible of inequality. That is, particular people and particular cultures, nations, industries, and economic systems have caused and contributed to the pollution that created the industrial greenhouse effect. So what we do as a nation matters very much indeed. Whether the encyclical can truly be a goad to the place where our own forms of privilege work for the planetary common good without getting mired in our election cycles, political punditry, and obsession with fiscal quarters, well, that is the question, isn't it? So what is an encyclical? What are its aspirational and real impacts? What are its shortcomings? These are questions towards which we are all collectively grappling, and the task is not just for scholars, but for all of us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Becky, and thank you, Dan. Happy to be here at St. Olaf College. It's my first visit. Hope it's not my last. I'm delighted to serve on this distinguished panel. Now, given the nature of tonight's topic, some of you might be wondering, what does an economist, let alone a Harvard economist, have to say possibly about the environment? So let me begin by telling you a brief story about this morning. I was at Logan Airport in Boston. I got on my flight
to come here, I sat down in my seat and I got out some work and a newspaper and my iPad, a variety of things. But it quickly became clear that the gentleman seated next to me wanted to chat. Now, the only reason that I had out the book, the newspaper, the iPad was as a defense. Because maybe you've noticed what I have. There tend to be two kinds of people who fly: those who like to have conversations with perfect strangers, and then the rest of us. So I'm very much in that second category. But he was determined. And so in order to start the conversation, he did it the way Americans do, a question that's polite in American society, but not in many others. He asked me, what business am I in? What do you do for a living? And at that moment, I did something foolish. I told him the truth. I said, I'm an environmental economist. And he looked at me, and I looked at him. Now, surely I'm not going to follow up because I don't want to talk in the first place. He doesn't say anything further. And we're sitting there looking into each other's eyes, and finally, I realized why it is that this gentleman who so much wanted to have a conversation wasn't following up. I realized that he had concluded that he had just met a living, breathing oxymoron, an internal contradiction. After all, it's either the economy or the environment. It's either the study of economics or the study of environment. So this phrase made absolutely no sense. Well, environmental economics is not oxymoronic, and the reasons why it's not is that the causes of environmental problems are economic, as I'll explain. And the consequences of environmental problems have very important economic dimensions. Hence, economics, as a way of thinking, is exceptionally valuable. Indeed, I'll argue essential to a full understanding of environmental problems, and therefore for the design of policies, of solutions, and implementation of those solutions that are meaningful. That is, they're not just a symbolic value, they make a difference. That are economically sensible, by which I mean we're not wasting resources that we could be spending on the other things we care about, like a food supply, like healthcare, like education, that it's cost effective, and that therefore they're more likely to be politically pragmatic. Now, this is especially true for a variety of reasons in the case of global climate change. That's the context. That's the context that I brought to my reading last June of Pope Francis's encyclical. The day it was released, writing in the New York Times, Coral Davenport noted that the Papal Encyclical, quote, is as much an indictment of the global economic order as it is an argument to the world to confront climate change, unquote. Now, Ms. Davenport went on to accurately quote me as saying that elements of the encyclical were unfortunately, quote, out of step with the thinking and the work of informed policy analysts around the world, unquote. So in the few minutes remaining that I have, what I want to do is to try to explain to you why I said that and why I think it's correct. First of all, as I've written in several places, the Pope is to be commended for taking global climate change seriously and for drawing more world attention to the issue. I think that goes without saying. There is much about the encyclical that is commendable, but where it drifts into matters of public policy, which it does, I fear that it is, unfortunately, not helpful. Now, to start with, the long encyclical ignores the causes of global climate change. Namely, they're an externality, an unintended consequence of fundamentally meritorious behavior by producers producing the goods and services that you and I and the panelists want, that we demand, and consumers, including all of us in this room, using those goods and services. Those are the causes. That's the cause of global climate change. That's why the problem exists in the first place. Now, there may well be ethical dimensions to the problem, as we've heard, and I won't debate that. But climate change is vastly more and dramatically different from a simple consequence of some immoral actions by corrupt capitalists. The encyclical also ignores the global commons nature of the problem, namely that greenhouse gases, when they're emitted, mix in the atmosphere. The result is it doesn't matter where they came from. They can come from the town here, from Beijing, Calcutta, New York. They have the same effect. It doesn't matter. What that means is that for every jurisdiction taking action, they incur the costs of taking actions, but the benefits of their taking action, reduced risk of climate change, are distributed globally. And what that means is that for virtually any jurisdiction, whether it's a country, a state, a province, a city, the benefits, the direct benefits they'll reap of taking action are less than the costs they'll incur, even though globally the benefits are much greater than the costs. That's what a global commons problem is. That creates the free rider incentive. And that's why international cooperation among nation states is absolutely necessary. Now, if the causes of the problem are not recognized, it's very difficult or impossible to come up with truly meaningful and feasible solutions. So yes, the problem is indeed caused by a failure of markets, as the Pope might say, or in the language of economics, a market failure. But that's precisely why sound economic analysis of the problem is important, is indeed essential, and can be exceptionally helpful to designing solutions that matter. Such analysis points the way to working through the market for solutions rather than condemning global capitalism per se. In surprisingly specific and unambiguous language, the encyclical rejects outright carbon credits, as it refers to them, as a part of the solution to the problem. It says they, quote, could give rise to a new form of speculation and would not help to reduce the overall emissions of polluting gases, unquote. And I apologize, I don't have the paragraph number for that. So.
Yeah.
The encyclical goes on to assert that such an approach would help, quote, support the superconsumption of certain countries and sectors, unquote. That completely misleading and fundamentally misguided rhetoric, like most of the discussion of economics in the encyclical, is straight out of the playbook. It is virtually quotations that I've read countless times before and that I've had to listen to in the climate negotiations from the ALBA countries, the Bolivarian Alliance. This is the small set of socialist Latin American countries, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Cuba, El Salvador, and sometimes some others in and out, that are opposed to the world economic order, that are fearful of free markets, that are not democratic, and have been utterly dismissive and uncooperative in the international climate negotiations for 20 years. And it continued in Paris. Those countries have been strongly opposed to any market-based approaches to climate change, including carbon taxes, cap-and-trade systems, and offset systems, as well as any approaches that would allow, through appropriate linkage, the financing by one country, a wealthy one, of emissions reductions in another country, a poorer one. which, by the way, is one of the primary, most important elements of the Paris Climate Agreement that was achieved in December of last year, and is absolutely necessary for successful implementation, and is absolutely necessary to bring down costs over time in order to achieve greater ambition. Now, if the Pope's reference to carbon credits were intended to refer only to so-called offset systems and not to cap-and-trade systems, then I probably would be less concerned about that specific complaint. But the encyclical does not make the distinction. Indeed, I doubt that the authors of the encyclical recognize the difference. And unfortunately, most readers of the encyclical, virtually all readers of the encyclical, will likewise lump together all carbon markets. So I respect tremendously what the Pope says about the need for action, but what I consider to be his very unfortunate attack on the use of markets to address climate change is completely out of step with the best thinking and dedicated work of informed policy analysts and policymakers around the world who recognize that we can do more, we can do it faster, and we can do it better by the use of market-based policy instruments. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has been outspoken in precisely that regard, and some 100 countries recognize this in their submissions that they made in Paris to the global climate talks. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Umbrella Agreement, itself explicitly states that, quote, policies and measures to deal with climate change should be cost-effective so as to ensure global benefits at the lowest possible cost and thereby be more ambitious. That's why market-based climate policy instruments are an essential option, a very important option for many countries around the world. And no, not just for the industrialized countries. I'm talking about 100 countries that spoke to this in Paris. Keeping costs down will help bring about greater ambition. So to conclude, the papacy can be commended for having drawn attention to the climate change issue. But sadly, the encyclical fails to recognize that because externalities such as CO2 emissions are a type of market failure, and because the global commons nature of the problem and consequent free riding by nations is itself a profound market failure, it is precisely for these reasons that working through the market is absolutely necessary in order to address the climate problem, this massive challenge that we have, in ways that are scientifically meaningful, economically sensible, and ultimately politically pragmatic. By incorporating the anti-market rhetoric of the ALBA countries, the encyclical unfortunately went beyond errors of omission and incorporated significant errors of commission by emphasizing a perspective that, in my mind, is not progressive and is not enlightened, and would, I fear, ultimately work against meaningful climate policy at the international level, at the regional level, at the national level, and at the subnational level. That is why I said that although there is much about the encyclical that may be commendable, where it drifts into matters of public policy as it does, it is unfortunately not helpful. Thank you very much.
thanks very much for the invitation to be here. I've enjoyed both sets of remarks. I think Professor Stavins and I are actually somewhat on the same page in our reaction to the encyclical, although we approach it in somewhat different idioms. Whereas he's an environmental economist, I was trained as a political philosopher and intellectual historian. So I think you might hear some echoes in some of the things he said. I'll put it perhaps a little bit differently. My remarks have a kind of title to them which give you a sense of where I'm coming from. The title being Liberal Modernity versus Pope Francis. It's impossible not to be impressed with the theological and moral seriousness of Laudato Si, Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment. Whether it's politically and economically wise is another matter. The Pope makes a powerful case for profound changes in how every person living on the planet thinks about the natural world and the place of humanity within it. Above all, he wants us to adopt an integral ecology that views the planet as our common home, a home that deserves to be treated with humility and respect instead of as an object to be used for our selfish ends. If the human race learned to do that, to be more than, quote, masters, consumers, and ruthless exploiters, to resist putting blind confidence in technical solutions, then we just might restrain our insatiable appetite for development, which he describes as the economic motor that pollutes the planet's air and water, fueling climate change and threatening to harm everyone, but especially the most vulnerable among us, the world's poor. The indictment is radical. We need nothing short of, quote, a bold cultural revolution to avoid fulfilling doomsday predictions, in which we leave coming generations a planet filled with, I love this, debris, desolation, and filth. Though the Pope helpfully clarifies that, quote, nobody is suggesting a return to the Stone Age, he does say we need to look at reality in a different way and recover the values and the great goals swept away by our unrestrained delusions of grandeur, unquote. Practically speaking, this means that halfway measures based on adjusting people's economic preferences and incentives, like buying and selling carbon credits, need to be dismissed as a mere ploy to protect excessive consumption and forestall the radical change which present circumstances require. Truly decisive action, he claims, would involve individuals and classes and countries, and even all members of the human species, ceasing to put their own good ahead of those of others. This would include accepting decreased growth in some parts of the world, which is the only way truly to rein in, quote, those who constantly consume and destroy. The argument is worth pondering, but it's also worth contesting. And there's no better way to do so, to my mind, than to remind ourselves of the strongest arguments on the other side. Not arguments in favor of fouling our nest and turning the planet into a sauna, but the most cogent arguments in favor of the view of nature and humanity that Pope Francis believes we need to overthrow. Those arguments were first made by the writers who most deeply inspired liberal modernity, our world. Niccolò Machiavelli, René Descartes, Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke. These men wrote in opposition to what they believed to be the doleful practical consequences of the Christian view of the natural world and humanity's place within it, the view that Francis says we need to return to. What is this Christian view? In sum, that human beings ought to be humble, act with restraint in their dealings with nature, and put their faith in God. When they do so, God will provide for them. In the view of these early modern proto-liberals, this Christian outlook leads people to be supine in the face of exploitation by the powerful including corrupt members of the clergy, and submissive when confronting a natural world that, when untransformed by human ambition and ingenuity, is often inhospitable to human beings and frequently inimical to their flourishing. After more than a millennium bathed in an ethic of Christian humility, these writers argued, European life was marked by oppression, poverty, and passive acceptance of a natural order that showed no sign of guidance by the hand of God. Such a situation leaves human beings subject to powers, fate, and malign human will that can and will destroy them. The proper response isn't acceptance. It's standing up for ourselves and taking matters into our own hands. That's why Machiavelli, in language still shocking to our late modern ears, counseled that we take firm control of fate, beat her and strike her down. And why Bacon thought that we should use scientific knowledge to relieve man's estate, and why Descartes proposed that we aim to become masters and possessors of nature by unleashing human ambition and ingenuity in the fields of science, medicine, and technology, and why Hobbes and Locke devised their state of nature teachings to serve as modern fables that would overthrow the Christian presumption that God will provide for us if we prostrate ourselves before him and his creation. No, he most certainly will not, these writers implied. Life in a natural state, according to Hobbes, is nasty, brutish, and short, and if we ever hope to enjoy what he called commodious living, we need to stop relying on the protection of an imaginary or perhaps merely indifferent or absent God. Who can deny that these prophets of material and political progress were right in the decisive respect? Before long, the Western world began to enjoy rapidly rising standards of living, the first stabs at political self-government, and then railroads, indoor plumbing, declining infant mortality, electricity, anesthesia, automobiles, airplanes, motion pictures, dentistry, refrigeration, antibiotics, televisions, electron microscopes, declining food prices and expanding food choices, space travel, advances in telecommunications, computers, the internet, and air conditioning. Yes, even the great good of air conditioning, which the Pope openly scorns in the Encyclical. And are there downsides to economic and technological development? Of course there are. Exploitation of workers, alienation and anomie, the moral confusions spread by markets and exacerbated by cultural pluralism, nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction, and the very real and very serious environmental challenges that Pope Francis highlights so powerfully in the encyclical. But liberal modernity's response to these challenges, unlike the Pope's, does not involve a radical, and at this point unlikely and undesirable, moral reorientation toward the natural world. From the beginning, liberal modernity's great strength has been a sober and somewhat cynical view of human motivation. Take human beings as they are, and not as they should be. Unleash their ambition, allow individuals to seek knowledge and profit, use political and economic institutions to channel that striving in publicly beneficial directions, and many people will benefit from the creation of wealth, no less than from scientific and technological advances. But they will also benefit from a revitalization of politics. Christian categories of thinking had a tendency to flatten out political life, because in comparison to our highest and most exalted spiritual ends, all politics can appear irredeemably sinful and sordid. We can hear echoes of this in the Pope's almost sneering account of how we organize our public lives according to selfishness. But someone who acts selfishly is acting with an eye to his own good, or the good of his own political community. Is it really wise to denigrate so severely such love, love for actual neighbors, you might say, in favor of the infinitely more abstract love for all of humanity or even the entire natural world? In the Pope's remarks, one senses an intense irritation with people not behaving like angels. But of course we're not angels. Maybe as a religious leader, such moral suasion is appropriate, but the encyclical is also a political document, and the kind of politics it proffers is so utopian, it amounts to saying that we can't tackle climate change until we create heaven on earth. And if that's the case, then I'm afraid we're all doomed. The liberal approach, as well as the approach favored by the discipline of economics, is very different. It assumes, rightly, that human beings are never angels, that they always act with an eye to what they think is their own good. It then seeks to devise incentives to get publicly desirable outcomes. It's messy. It often fails. But what really is the alternative, aside from sermons and homilies, that is? Practically speaking, liberal modernity's proposed solution to climate change is therefore to impose regulations and devise incentives to get individuals and businesses to change their behavior, clean up their messes, and pursue alternative renewable forms of energy that do less damage to the earth in the future. A system of carbon credits, rejected by Pope Francis as morally compromised, is precisely one such approach. The perhaps unhappy but nonetheless unavoidable fact of human life at both the individual and collective levels is that with certain very rare, extremely rare exceptions, people will only alter their behavior when they become convinced that the costs of keeping things constant are greater than making a change. That means making the case in terms of costs and benefits, not abstract moral ideals that refuse to accept anything short of purity and perfection. The fact is that slowing economic growth, which the Pope endorses in various passages of the encyclical, deliberately slowing economic growth and heavily regulating industries has a significant human cost, very much including to the poor. Denying those costs is not only dishonest, it's also foolish, since it risks running a risk of provoking an anti-environmental backlash against the reforms that we need. Instead of denying the very real costs of changing our ways or concealing them under a rhetoric of moral exhortation, we would be much better off explaining in careful, scientifically rigorous ways the often much greater costs that are likely to follow from doing nothing or less than we should. These costs include rising sea levels, widespread flooding and droughts, increased incidence of severe weather events, and the dramatic constriction of arable land. Once we look at these costs and persuade people that they are real and that they are important and are going to hurt, then the unavoidable trade-offs can be faced squarely and honestly. Does that still leave the human race facing a massive collective action problem? You bet it does. Perhaps the most complex one in human history, precisely because it's global. But there really is no way to avoid that, which is why I'd much prefer to read proposals suggesting realistic strategies to ameliorate that problem and mitigate its effects than the Pope's well-meant but ultimately ineffective moral disquisitions and denunciations. Such moral declamations, moving, impressive in their way, but also ultimately impotent to change people's motives in the decisive respect, remind me a little too much of the wishful thinking that justifiably provoked the modern project in the first place. Thank you.
Well, that was interesting. Are there any questions? Yes. I think we have microphones.
Do you have a copy of your essay? I'd love to First of all, thank you so much for being here tonight with us. My name is Zarif Kamal. I'm an economics and math major here. So my question is a bit in the theology department, but I would like to hear all your opinions on this. So in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, God says to mankind, "Go forth and be fruitful." Historically, that has had many interpretations. The Pope has taken a particular spin on it. So my question is, what does that mean for the common Catholic? In fact, for people around the world, does that have far-reaching consequences, or is that a statement that is to come to an end when the Pope goes down from office? That is my question. Thank you.
That's a great question, especially from an economics and math major who's clearly read the document. Thank you. So in chapter 2 of the encyclical, the Pope stops talking to everyone and says, all right, so you folks who are interested in the Christian Bible, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament as Christians, let's think about biblical interpretation and what the legacy of interpretation of these Genesis passages has justified. And he says, insofar as historical interpretation of these passages that humans should have dominion has been taken to mean domination, well then perhaps we need to rethink the parameters of that interpretation. Perhaps we need to read the Bible differently and say maybe there need to be limits to domination. Maybe dominion implies stewardship and a range of other kinds of behaviors oriented towards the flourishing of land and communities over time. So your point is great, and it's totally interesting to talk through how the Pope brings these kinds of scriptures into conversation with contemporary ecological reality, because he's doing a number of things at once that most religious figures don't do. Number one, he's actively saying, hey, I think the Catholic Church might have been wrong in how we were interpreting this. So let's think about whether we can do it better. That's pretty humble, in my opinion. There's a lot to be said about biblical interpretation and the Catholic Church and science and various other things, but it's noteworthy. And then putting that in conversation with some of the contemporary science, I think that a lot of folks who work in religious ethics of the environment would want to say, with the Pope, yeah, we need a stance of stewardship, not domination. And insofar as political economic arrangements contribute to a short-term domination mentality that exhausts land, pollutes water, degrades people, etc., then we have a problem. Good question. You guys want to take that?
One thing I would just add, you've put your finger on a real tension in the encyclical having to do with the Church's teaching on contraception. If the Pope's very kind of extreme statements about the kind of moral transgression involved in a view of the natural world that doesn't involve a moral reorientation seems to imply that we're putting too much pressure on the planet, and usually environmentalists who believe that go the next step and say, therefore, we need to vastly decrease the human population. That would decrease the burdens on the globe, on the climate, on the ecology of the planet. And the Pope goes in that direction when he talks about decreasing economic growth, but he doesn't go there when it comes to at least he doesn't really go in that direction when it comes to actually saying that we need to curtail the population, because that would require the use of contraception to lead people to have fewer children. And the Church's teaching is that you shouldn't do that. Actually, you shouldn't use contraception at all and have very large families. But as the population of the Earth increases, if each of those families has a large family, very quickly you end up with exploding population. And so some people in a kind of pesky kind of a twinkle in the eye way, did come after the Pope after this and made the point that, like, well, you know, you're going to be having to endorse condom use soon if you're going to actually make a difference here. And I don't see how he gets around that problem, frankly, in the end. I mean,
I'll respond to that if I can. I think that the population question is a huge one in environmental, ecological, and economic conversations at present, development writ large. And there are internal conflicts in the encyclical, absolutely. I also want to point out, however, that population and resource pressures are not straightforward one-to-one correlations. So ever since 1798, when Thomas Robert Malthus published an essay on the principle of population, there's been the fairly clear prognostication that while resources increase at an arithmetic rate, given enough time, human populations and other populations will increase geometrically, therefore putting pressure on the available resources and leading to some kind of catastrophic, in the words of Paul and Anne Ehrlich in 1968, population bomb and collapse or massive resource scarcity problem. So this is an issue. How much population is too much? What kind of resources can sustain what kind of population? These are important questions, and they need to be on the table. If you want to look at some useful and interesting debates about this, the New York Times did a series on it last summer. The New Security blog does some really interesting stuff on population. But one of the important points is that not all individuals in the world consume resources at the same rate. So small percentages of the world's population are responsible for the pollution and consumption and indeed carbon dioxide emissions far more than many others. So the bottom billions don't contribute the most to resource exploitation. It's those of us on top of the pile of privilege who do, which leads again to the questions of differential responsibilities. So definitely population is an issue, definitely contraception, women's empowerment, huge issues for the Catholic Church, as I noted. But I would caution against a one-to-one equation between population and resource consumption.
So I was intending to stay out of any conversation that used the word theology, since I have no competence whatsoever on the topic. But since we just heard about population and the predictions of Malthus, let's recognize that it is well established from 75 years of research that the reason why the Malthus's prediction didn't take place is because of the demographic transition as it's known. And the demographic transition is that population growth rates go down with economic growth. And we see this around the world. I could quote for you 14 different countries where that's the turning point right now. It's economic growth that brought it about. That said, there's so much concern about the industrialized world is doing this to the developing world. If that's really the concern, and I think that's a legitimate concern, and I can picture how that's in itself, sort of an ethical issue, then why are we talking about climate change? Why aren't we talking about the most important environmental problem in the world that's hurting people in developing countries? Indoor air pollution from using biomass for cooking. 10 to 15 million people will die next year, largely women and children, all in developing countries. Or why aren't we talking about the other important environmental problem in the world now, not 10, 20, 30 years from now? And that's water pollution, surface water pollution in major urban areas as a result of poor sanitation. It's another 10 to 15 million people will die next year. If you go back to 1992, the original United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, which was supposed to be about environmental problems in developing countries, those were the big issues then. They're still the big issues now. The talks were successfully captured by the countries of the North. And what came out of it? A convention on biodiversity, which surely the developing countries didn't care about, right? We had already cleared the Great Plains. We didn't want them to clear the Amazon. And a convention on climate change. Now, I make my living working on climate change. I've been doing it for years and years. But truly, if we're thinking about the problems of developing countries, those are the bigger problems.
I agree with much of what you've said and think that, in fact, all of those are noted in the encyclical as problems. But why are they not visible to those of us having conversations more standardly in the halls of power? These are very good questions.
Thank you very much for the presentations. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at St. Olaf, and I'm also connected with the Institute for Freedom and Community. I'm tempted to say about the Pope tonight what Donald Trump said about Marco Rubio last night. It's been a rough night for the Pope. And so while I share a good number of the reservations that have been expressed about the encyclical and about some of the specific policy proposals, I'm wondering whether or not hidden in some of the debate with the Pope there aren't competing conceptions of social justice that might be involved. And what I mean by that is that in some large sense, the Pope operates with a conception of social justice which suggests that policies, proposals, et cetera, and so forth, need to be assessed from the perspective of the impact on the worst off in society, the worst off in the world. In this respect, his theory of justice actually isn't all that different from the theory of justice advocated by secularist political philosopher John Rawls, who taught for many years at Harvard University. So I suppose this set of considerations leads me to the question, might in some measure the conversation be a conversation about efficiency in solving the problem of the environment versus short-term, long-term impact on the worst off in the world or in particular societies. So for example, with respect to cap and trade, I'm not an economist, so obviously I have to be instructed on this matter. Is there any point to saying that while this might be efficient with respect to solving the problem of the environment, it has either short-term or long-term a negative impact on the worst off, say what it does to pricing generally. Again, I'm not an economist, I have to be instructed. Such that the Pope might want to say, you're going to have to take a beating on efficiency in some measure with respect to the environmental problem if you take seriously the impact of policy A, policy B, or policy D, C or D on the worst off in society. I address that question to anybody on the panel. Thank you.
Yes.
So, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
There are frequently trade-offs, well observed and studied in economics, between efficiency and distributional equity. It so happens in the case of cap and trade, there are not. The virtue of a cap and trade mechanism, and the reason why I think it's so important in the international domain, is that a cap and trade mechanism provides one of those rare opportunities to get what you called efficiency, but what is actually cost effectiveness in economic terms, to get that for the aggregate, and at the same time to achieve distributional equity, and you do that through the initial allocation of the allowances. It's as simple as that. That's how you do it. And it's for that reason, actually, that these things are politically attractive and have been used. Because what you or I might call distributional equity in a representative democracy, people say, getting the bennies for my district. And a very important property of a cap and trade mechanism is that its ultimate performance, and indeed its ultimate aggregate cost, is independent of the initial allocation of the allowances. That's how distributional equity is addressed. And that's precisely what would happen for what I was talking about with Paris.
This isn't the Pope's position. I've heard other kinds of arguments along these lines. If you're really concerned about the situation of the dispossessed in the world, you ought to be marshaling a larger percentage of resources in support of curing malaria than being worried about the environment. And so if that were the case, would there be, obviously this isn't the Pope's argument, but it's in the spirit in some measure of the Pope's conception of justice. Is there any point to that kind of claim? Is there a kind of trade-off here such that we might be talking about different conceptions of social justice, such that we need to modify our ambitions with respect to one area of policy in order to serve the least advantaged with respect to another?
Well, you know, there is a scholar
who's not very well liked by a lot of people, probably including many people in this room if they recognize his name, Bjorn Lomborg. Yeah. So, and Lomborg says a lot of stuff that's not right. I'm actually writing something now that shows, that critiques him. But his point, which it's hard not to agree with, is that if one were able to allocate resources, if there was this central planning at the United Nations, which there is not, that would determine exactly what problems we're going to deal with where, then the ordering of those problems would not, by any means whatsoever, have climate change at this moment at the top, compared to other problems that are right now getting much less attention for a variety of economic reasons, political reasons, and probably social reasons that I don't understand. So that's legitimate. But the truth is we don't have that kind of decision-making. Priorities aren't set that way. At best, they're set that way within individual nation states and countries.
I think your question about whether there are competing notions of social justice at play is entirely apt, and as indicated by my one-word answer, yes, I think that's true. I also think it's useful to disambiguate questions about the weird, admittedly weird lines on carbon credits in the encyclical from questions of the trade-offs, to use your language, of embracing various visions of justice. And there are lots of ways of construing justice. You're right that for the Catholic Church, for the Pope in this document, notions of justice have to be accountable to equity, sometimes distributional equity, especially in the case of environmental resources, to what is in Christian language referred to as the least among us, so the most vulnerable, the poorest. And that is a different individualized measure that is distinct from and admittedly hard to quantify and hard to tap into in some ways. It's much harder than measures of economic growth or other mechanisms of development. And there is a lot of social, economic, and political good entailed in various aggregate notions of justice as achievement of economic growth or various other kinds of ends. So I want to disambiguate that important question from the question of carbon credits, even though I so appreciate Professor Stavins' incursions into this because there's a lot to be critiqued there. At the same time, I also want to resist assuming that all of these things have to be mutually exclusive, that one vision of social justice is opposed to another vision of justice. I think that various frameworks of understanding value and goods shed light on important aspects of human life, on things that we seek as ends and mechanisms that may get us there. And the question is not whether one ought to trump in some idealistic pure binary system the other. The question is how do we mitigate and massage through the pragmatic mechanisms at our disposal to achieve the best kinds of outcomes after we've deliberated in as inclusive a way as possible about them.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah, cool. My name is Nathan, and I'm a French political science and philosophy major. And my question tonight is in the vein of questions that have been asked already. But in the interest of international relations and what it seems to me is a problem that requires solutions that cross borders in a very real sense, in what way do we avoid the way that imperialism and certain forms of justice and certain conceptions of the way the world should be ordered enters into a global economy? Thank you.
I'm not sure if I understood, so maybe I'm just interpreting it the way I could understand the question, which may not have been the thrust that you're thinking of. So if your question was asking, since this is a global commons problem, international relation cooperation is required, how do we avoid the situation where the decision-making, both the instruments that are used, the targets, everything else, are dominated by the wealthiest countries in the world and their view? And is that a fair interpretation? Okay, so and that's something that in this case actually you don't have to worry about. In lots of other situations, you would. And that's because of the fact that the international negotiations, which are flawed in lots of other ways, but are not a problem in terms of your issue, because they're done under the rules of the General Assembly. It's one country, one vote. And it's under basis of consensus, which is now interpreted not as unanimity, but all but five. You know, so you get like 190 countries. That's what's required. And it's one country, one vote. The developing world absolutely dominates that. It's not even close. That's been the nature of the talks. I'm not saying that's necessarily good. I'm not taking a position on the merits, but in terms of your concern, that's not a concern you should have about the United Nations climate negotiations.
Dr. Linker, I am wondering what your sober and cynical view of liberal modernity might be on this question.
Thank you for asking that.
I would need to hear something more specific, like a specific problem, like an example, like somewhere in the world of someone or a country doing something that you think is a problem, and like rather than just generally.
Well, I guess my concern is that even if it does come down to a one-to-one, every country gets its say in the General Assembly, it seems to me that there could be ways that a very specific way of addressing problems through a very liberal outlook could come to dominate the perspective that that body has, or that other social bodies have, as they deliberate on issues of climate change.
Well, I mean, in my view, that's what we need. It's precisely the countries in Central and South America that Dr. Stavins pointed to, who are kind of trying to think about these things outside the liberal framework, who are kind of scuttling deals or doing their best to scuttle deals that actually might help. So in my view, it might be true that it's one country, one vote, which sounds very democratic, but of course the United Nations is a liberal institution created by liberal governments. We tried to create an early version of it with the League of Nations before World War II, and then we set up the UN, and lo and behold, it's right here in America, the big liberal behemoth of all, on the whole globe. That's a liberal institution. It says, get together and hash out your differences, and we trust that we'll do the best that human beings are capable of doing, which often will disappoint us, but it's better than not getting together and trying to figure it out in as fair a way as we can and muddling through. I would guess my cynical outlook and defense of liberal modernity is it's the outlook of let's try to muddle through at all times and not expect much more than that, but be pretty proud of ourselves when we manage to do it.
I mean, the approach that is favored by most analysts that have spent a tremendous amount of time, and I'm referring not just to economists, in this case really to political scientists more than any other discipline, of the climate negotiations, would actually go in the opposite direction of what I think you would like to see, because rather than it being 195 countries, one country, one vote, they would say, and I have said, that let's recognize that one of the reasons it's so impossible to get anything done is that you've got that large set of countries who are very diverse, trying to reach agreement. And by the way, 90% of the emissions come from 20 countries and regions, if you count the EU as one. And wouldn't it be a lot easier to get decision making within that group? And that, obviously would not be supportive, at least I think it would not be supportive of the thrust of where you were going.
One thing I would like to add, just that occurred to me when you were just talking, is we have to keep in mind that we were talking about population before. Population, for instance, in Africa is growing very, very quickly. And economic growth is picking up and is likely going to pick up even more, quite a bit more over the coming decades, which means that it might be true now that just these 20 countries or regions, including the EU, are responsible for something like 90% of the pollutants. That isn't going to be true for that long. And what I was talking about in my remarks about the need to look at these things as trade-offs, brings you to kind of sobering conclusions that, well, Do we want Africa to develop economically so that the burgeoning population there actually can enjoy some of the fruits of prosperity? Of course we do. But that means that they're going to be contributing to this problem in the future perhaps as much as we are. I mean, Africa is an entire continent filled with dozens of countries with huge burgeoning population, and they are going to be polluting a heck of a lot in the future. So, sometimes in passages of this encyclical, I almost get the feeling like, what, does the Pope want only the countries on top to stop enjoying growth and to kind of stop with our own development so that those other countries can grow and then it'll be okay because we'll cut, but they'll come up? But now that can't really be what he thinks, right? So then what does he think? Like they should hold down their growth and we'll hold down our growth? And then would that be good? Would the people living in Africa with this growing population, if their economies don't grow and they don't create jobs for people to actually earn a living and enjoy all the things that they can see on televisions that other people around the world are enjoying, that wouldn't be good politically, certainly. It would lead to probably a lot of resentment and anger, and you could, so I mean the problems multiply. I reside intellectually in the liberal world and think that the best hope, though not one that gives me tremendous expectations for success, but my hope, the greatest possible hope, is that we keep growing, they keep growing, and we figure out how to regulate how we grow so as to minimize these negative externalities that can't be just wished away.
I think we ended on a note of hope. Oh, I guess we have one more question.
Just a comment. So you're basically blaming a whole continent that is not doing anything right now for what they might do in the future, and you spend more time elaborating on that than you spend commenting on how those top countries right now are polluting the planet.
I don't think I blamed anyone.
You're saying that in 30 years is going to be a problem, and you're...
It will, but I'm not blaming them. We are creating all kinds of problems now, but so will they, and there's no blame involved at all. It's what happens when countries develop economically.
Just try to find a solution.
I guess we have some more questions over here. Yes.
I have one thing to say, and that is in response to your almost futuristic expectation that Africa, or at least countries in Africa, would be contributing a lot to
we get a microphone?
the environmental degradation, and four of the first countries who have the best plan to tackle it. Four of the countries who have the best plan to tackle climate change and sustainable growth are in Africa. The first one is Morocco and Ethiopia and Libya and all of that. And I do think it's like a wrong expectation. And I think sustainable growth is not a Western ideology, and it can be changed. And I have a question, and it is about the Paris climate deal. And in my opinion, there is a great difference between justice and equality. And I think what the deal does is it aims, to equate everyone. It goes for equality, and I think, the countries who have contributed the most to our environmental problems, you guys have said, are in the West. And I was wondering, what do you think are some of the shortcomings of that deal, and how can we make it like an equal deal so that countries who contribute more, can do more to fix our problem?
Well, I think the first thing I should say is just to make a friendly amendment to the premise of your question, because you said pretty quickly that the ones who are contributing so much are in the West. So the growth in emissions in the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, essentially the industrialized world, is zero. There is no growth in emissions. It's up a little bit one year, down another. There is essentially zero growth in the OECD. Let me finish. So that's number one. The growth is China, India, Brazil, Korea, South Africa, Mexico, and Indonesia, if you include deforestation. It's the large emerging economies. I don't critique them for that any more than you were blaming anyone. We celebrate the fact that these large countries are taking off economically. Recognize that the largest emitter in the world is not in the West. The largest emitter in the world is China. Now, if you look at historical emissions, then there's a point. But it only goes so far, because China will surpass the United States, depending upon relative rates of economic growth and possibly policies, mainly economic growth rates, within 10 to 15 years. They'll be the #1 contributor to the problem, and other countries are catching up. The difference of the Paris Agreement is, rather than pointing fingers at each other, as I was doing and you were doing, as we were both doing, pointing fingers, what the Paris Agreement says is, each of you on your own stand up and tell us what you're going to do. Don't tell us what you think other countries should do. Tell us what you're going to do. That's the difference in the approach from the history that goes back to the Berlin Mandate and before Kyoto even. That's a very important difference. So that was all on the premise of your question. Let me answer your question. What's missing? The scope. What's important about the Paris Agreement is we've gone from 14% of global emissions being covered, which is the Kyoto Protocol, Europe and New Zealand. That's what it covers right now in its second commitment period. As a result of the contributions, the submissions in Paris, 185 countries representing 96% of global emissions are now covered. We've gone from 14% to 96%. That broad scope is absolutely necessary to meaningfully address the problem. But it's not sufficient. It's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition. What's also needed is adequate ambition of the individual, they're called INDCs, and implementation of them, living up to them. So those are the challenges going forward. That's what I'm engaged in, spending all my time flying off to Singapore in a couple of days, working on this. That's what's going to be happening over the next year, where, as you may know, the next meeting is in Marrakesh in Morocco. That's the challenge now, is putting the meat on what is very much a bare bones agreement. But it's a bare bones agreement that we would be making, in my view, a huge mistake to ignore this opportunity. Because after 20 years of fruitless negotiations because of a false start with an approach that was never going to be functional, we're now trying a new approach. And I'm hopeful that it could work. But you know what? I'm not going to see if it worked. I won't know. You will. Because I won't be here. It's going to be 10, 20, 30 years from now before we're going to know if this approach is fruitful. But you're going to be here to know, and you're going to be here to make sure that it is fruitful, I hope.
And that gets us back, in a sense, to some of the moral or more broadly ethical questions. Is these are problems that are, as Robert, you pointed out in your talk, they're not like those classical problems in morality where I lie to you or I kick you because I'm annoyed and so I've committed some wrong against you and then I can apologize and fix it. These are collective action problems that are not necessarily the sum results of individual virtue or vice. And I think that there are a lot of huge questions raised by the encyclical, some about economics and whether externalities are accidents that we can fix or whether they are endemic to the ways that economic theory works and political economies function. I think there are huge questions about human motivation and what we choose to pay attention to, whether spiritually or politically or in our communities at various levels of scale. But ultimately, it's also a question of how much we intend to care about outcomes that we won't see, and how much we trust that our collective mumbling, bumbling, liberal modernity discernments can get us there. I'm invested in that project too. And, I have a lot of hope, but we'll see.
Well, I just want to thank our panelists. Please join me. They might be willing to take some extra questions afterwards, but we are sort of overstaying our welcome here, so please come down. Thank you.
Very nice
It was
job.
really great to hear your perspective, and
I
I hope we'll get a chance to talk more. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I find your critiques of the cap and trade carbon credit weirdness totally persuasive, because